another training section here in Decisions. My name is Kevin, and I'll be walking you through our flow concepts and runtime selection training here in our new version 8. So let's go ahead and get started. The learning objectives for today is that by the end of the training, you should be able to understand what the flow designer is and how it functions, be familiar with the available mapping options inside of the designer, know how to use the for each and for loop steps, and understand what runtime selection is and how to use it. Our flow designer is where I like to say all the magic happens inside of decisions. The flow is where we set up and design the automated process. So inside of the flow designer, you can set up multiple steps and have those steps run in a sequential manner or even a parallel manner. But ultimately, they're working together to produce an outcome. Connected connected components that sequentially execute steps. Steps can take in data and output data. Define the mapping types and debug to incrementally test. And we like to say debug and debug often. So inside of each one of the steps, just as you see here below, each one of these steps has input and outputs for those particular steps. So the inputs is where they take in data. Maybe it's coming from a database, maybe it's coming from earlier in the flow, from previous steps. And then each one of the steps is also going to produce an outcome or output data. And we will go through each one of these as well. But also inside of the debugger, the reason why we say debug early and debug often is that when you're creating your workflows, when you're creating your rules inside of the flow designer or inside of the rule designer, you want to make sure that what you're creating is actually working. There are actually times when I myself were building early on in my days at Decision, and I would get through a very large portion of my project, and then by the time I got to the end, I remember everything just completely blowing up. So please, throughout your process, even when you have just a few steps, make sure those few steps are running, saving frequently as well. And then once you have those few running, then you can continue on and you already know that those steps that you've already added are working properly. Now on to mapping types. So as I mentioned, each one of the steps inside of decisions, or whenever you drag on a step inside of the flow designer, is going to have an input and an output. So with these inputs, you're going to have options. And some of those options include you can set constants. So constants is when you use data and has the same name throughout the process. So when you use constant, it can't be set dynamically. It's going to be exactly what it says, a constant, whether it's a name or a number. That number will always be what is output or input inside of the step. Select from flow. This is most commonly used when to use a value that has already been produced in the flow. So this is a way that you can bring in data inside of the step from earlier inside of the flow or from a database, however is bringing inside of the flow. You can use this option to pass that data inside of the step. Null is where no information saved, sets value as null. So it's just basically going to give you that null value that can be used if you're using null values as a part of maybe tables or other steps. And it's important as well on certain steps you do have, and structures as well, you do have the ability to set whether or not that particular data can be a null value. So that's very important when you're setting up your data structures and also inside of your flow designer and on the steps. Ignore just ignores the value entirely. So that's not going to take in data, nor is it going to output data. And then finally, the converter. There are many different built-in converter flows, or you can build your own. So one of the built-in examples is where you convert a string to a date. Finally, on the outputs, you have a few options here as well. So you can rename, which is your steps are automatically going to use that rename option for the output, where it creates a new flow variable. But that flow variable, um, depending on the type of step that it is, it may be similar or it may be the same as your previous steps. So you have to be careful with that, in that if it is the same, decisions will let you know because the environment is self-validating. And if it is similar, then you have to change one step so that it doesn't match and it's not confusing to the decisions engine. Change value, that alters the value of an already declared variable. So maybe if you already have declared um, a random number or a certain number earlier in your flow, maybe it's a salary, but later on in the flow, that particular salary, you want to save a new number or a new amount, then you can use that change value option to alter that value. Reference creates a reference ID. Every time the reference ID is called within the flow, it returns or reruns, I'm sorry, the original step to produce a current list of data. Ignore, same as before, just ignores the entire field. Passes through original information without affecting it. And then finally, run converter flow. There are many different built-in converter flows, as we mentioned on the input mappings. Now, list handling, we're not going to get too in-depth with list handling for this particular training session. However, we do have an advanced flow concepts that you can check out, and it does go into detail for each one of these. So right now, we're just going to give a high overview of each one of the steps, and then we'll take a look at a few of these as we go inside of the Flow Designer. But the first one, or the most common one that is used, is the for each step. And the for each step is very useful in taking in a list of items and then handing them out one at a time. So maybe you have a flow that you've already set up and you want to, or a list, I'm sorry, that you've already set up, and you want to run each one of those items in that list through another process or another, maybe a entirely different subflow. You can do so, and it's going to take that list one at a time, starting at 0 and going down the list and manipulating that data or interacting with the data with the flow or the process that follows the for each step. Once you're done with the for each, it's going to have a done path on it, and then that done path just signifies that it's done. It's run through all of the particular items in that index or in that list, and you can now proceed to either add additional steps or connect it to the done path for the Flow Designer. The for loop loops through a set of steps for a specified number of iterations. So you can dynamically set the number of times that that particular loop will run. Maybe you only want it to run, maybe you don't have a list and you want that loop to run 4 times. Then you can do that and set it up in that particular manner. For each in group your items, group your list items by a common field, and then handle that list of items. A branch for each can kick off a dynamic list of items simultaneously. And then finally, run flows for lists. This functions much like a branch for each step. However, this has more performance enhancing options. So again, if you want to learn more about these list handling steps, please take a look at our advanced flow concepts training. Now, this is what we will cover in depth is runtime selection. So what is runtime selection? It is a process which occurs during float execution where decisions dynamically selects the next designer element to run based on the designer element ID. So this is a very neat uh, concept or a very neat step that you can use inside of decisions on specific steps. So specifically, it's going to be on the subflows and also your rules. So in using runtime selection, maybe you have a process where you're going to connect it to a subflow or run a subflow, but based on the input data, based on the data that is coming inside of, or the selections that are made inside of the previous steps preceding the subflow, maybe you want that particular subflow to run um, a certain flow. How you do that is by selecting that element ID. And what that element ID is referring to is just simply the flow ID, or maybe that rule ID. So as you see here, we have just a screenshot of what it looks like and how do you make that selection. So on the run subflow step, under selection type in an advanced column, you can pick which is the default is going to be picked. You can hit runtime selection as a second one, and we also do have champion challenger. And then the same thing for the rules. You do have that option as well. Now, as I mentioned before, when do you want to use this? So maybe your flow contains multiple statement rules with run subflows attached to them. So as you see, this is this is very detailed or very monotonous where you're going through um, multiple statement rules and multiple subflows. Well, in order to simplify this, we can narrow this down to just one statement rule and one subflow. And then by choosing runtime selection, which we'll do in our example, you can choose that ID, maybe from a previous rule, and then you can also make that selection on the run subflow, as we will see here in a few minutes. Now, how do you set this up? The template designer element must have, for the flows, the inputs must match and the outputs must match, as well as the assignments. So what do I mean by matching? That capitalization must match if you are actually taking in uh, a person's age. That age or the title or the name of that particular data must be the same. So if it's capital AGE, then on the output of that particular step and for the data that is coming inside of that subflow, it must be a capital AGE as well. And the same for the rules, the inputs and the outputs must match. Now you want to decide your selection paradigm. So one option would be a truth table, outputting element IDs, which we're going to use in our example here in a few seconds. And then also you can use a data structure or constants table that will output those element IDs. Now, once you make that runtime selection, you're going to be given an option on your rule or on your subflow to select or input that rule flow set ID or that flow ID or target ID, whatever you've named it inside of your flow, you're going to be able to pass that ID inside of this particular field by choosing select from flow, or maybe you always want it to run with a constant. Then you can set that field to be a constant and input in that element ID to run each and every time. Now, last but not least, you have an option on your subflows. So when you choose a runtime selection, you'll be given the option to run flow async and wait. Now what this does not run the subflow independently of the parent process. So typically, when you have some other options inside of decisions where you can run your flows async, typically they will be independent of the parent flow. That subflow will run and maybe it's going to output some data, but the parent flow will continue to run and not be dependent on the subflow. In this case, it does not run independently of the parent process. It executes on a separate thread. So while the, the flow is running, the parent flow is running, the subflow is going to run on a separate thread to gather that data. Returns data to the main flow. And then finally, this is useful in assisting in API calls that return large amounts of data. So let's go inside of our flow designer now. And let's take a look at our example for today. So this is a runtime selection and list example. So I've done a kind of a mashup between the lists and also runtime selection. But before we get started there, as I mentioned before, let's take a look at a couple of the for each steps. So as you see over here in the favorites column, we have this for each element. So for each element is going to be the same as your for each step. So what the step does is, as you see, you can input in a collection of data and then choose your type. But also, when you choose that collection, let's just go ahead and just make this connection right here so you can see exactly what I mean here. If I connect it to it and I choose my list here or my collection here, as you see, it automatically populates data type. Is going to recognize what type of data it is, and then your outputs are going to be the item and the item index. And from there, we can add additional steps. So for our list of sports, maybe we want to remove one of the items and add it to a separate list. We will take this next path and perform that logic that we would like to have on as additional here. And then once it's done running through each one of these sports or each one of the items in the list, we can take the done path now and continue on with our process, whether it's going to the end step or adding additional steps for the configuration of our process. Another thing to note is that when you're searching for your for each inside of your toolbox here, this is the only step that will come up when you're searching for your for each when it's separated. However, if I would combine those, now I have more of those steps available to me. So just keep that in mind as you're searching for them. Early on, again, I was searching for the for each step and I was like, where is that step? I have no clue where it is. And last but not least, I want to just take a look at the for loop step. So if we have our process here, maybe we wanted to loop through this process 4 times. We can take this for loop step here and then either select from flow a certain number, or we can just choose a number 4 and we can loop through this entire process 4 times, bring that back over, this particular step back over to our for loop step, And then once we're done, then connect our done path to the end step. Well, I just wanted to just touch on just a few of those most commonly used list management steps. And let's get to our process now. So for this particular process, we have a list of sports. And what we're going to be doing is performing a registration for a youth sports program. So we're going to have a list of sports we're going to bring inside of our form here. And on that form, a registrant will be able to input some data, their name, their age, and choose the sport they would like to play. We're going to take that information or take that date of birth through our difference in years here. And what this difference in years is going to do is compare that date of birth to the current date and time, and it's going to output the age of that participant. And for our truth table here, what we're going to do now with this truth table is pass in our element ID that we discussed earlier. So based on that age of that youth player, we want to send them to a particular registration form. If they're 10 years old or younger, then it will go to a certain registration form. If they're 11 years and older, then it's going to go to another different registration form. So this is just a very simple way for you to see how to set up or how to pass in a target ID. And what I've done here is these are target IDs for my different flows. So what I'm going to do here is go here inside of my designer view, inside of my list, inside the studio, and show you exactly where I got that information from. So I see here for players 10 years old or less or younger, my ID 66F8D. Once we go here, this is my registration flow. Let me actually go in here to show you what it looks like. And this is just a registration form for youth that are 10 years old or younger. And so I just have some basic information. This information at the top, these three fields will automatically be populated based on the input from the registrant, and then the parent will have the option to fill in these fields down here at the bottom. And now once I go back, what I can do now is go down to I manage and then get flow ID. Now with that flow ID here, this is exactly what I use, 66F8D for players 10 years old or younger. And then the same thing for the 11 years old and up, which would be a different form, which we will see inside of the flow once we debug it. And the same thing goes for rules. If we wanted to use a rule for our runtime selection, then we can go to manage again and get the truth table ID if that would be the case. And here's the ID that we will input. So very simple to use and very simple to get. Now if we go back here inside of our flow designer, last but not least, here is our subflow. So all I've done here, if I expand this over here to the right, is dragged on the subflow and chosen the option for runtime selection. Of course, by default, as I mentioned before, it's going to automatically pick as the default, but you have to go down here, select that. Here's our run flow async and wait option that we discussed in our slides. And then we're going to have an option to edit the target. So just to show you what that's like, since we've already created these flows, our 10-year-old and our 11 and up registration, I can just pick that from here, or I can create it if I hadn't already created it. Once I pick it, as you see here, it automatically updates my inputs, and it is ready to go. Sometimes you will have to um, manually set these depending on the name of the data that you're using and whether or not it's matching to that, whether it's coming in inside of the flow. But you always want to make a habit of doing that as much as possible, because decisions will be able to match those items or match those data types very easily if they do match. So let's go up here to the top and use our debug button. And again, this is Decision's very own testing environment. We can come in, test our workflows, test your rules, just to make sure everything is functioning properly. So if we go in, we're going to just input the name Tom Hansen, and we want him to be less than 10. So we're just going to go back a few years here and just say he was born in 2017. And he's interested in baseball. Once I click register, as you see, it's going to automatically choose my 10 and under registration, as you see here, and populate my player's name, the age, and the sport. And now I can just input in the parent's name, the address, and the phone number. And now I've completed my registration. And this can follow additional processes, however you would like to set up your use case. Now let's do this one more time though. And now we want our player to be older than 10 years old. So we're going to say Sally Thompson is her name. And she's going to be a little bit older. So let's say she was born in 2010. And she would like to swim. Once we click register, as you see, now we have a different form based on the title at the top. Now it's on the 11 and up registration. But the same information is pre-populated based on what was entered in earlier on our previous form. So again, this is a very, very simple example, but just wanted to show you through this example how easy it is to set up a runtime selection and different ways to handle lists. And hopefully this sparks some interest inside of our tool if you're not already a customer. If you are a customer already, or if you're not, maybe you want more information about the tool. Maybe you want information about becoming a client of Decisions. How you can do that is contacting us at training@decisions.com or at sales@decisions.com, or any of the other information as you see down here at the bottom of your screen. I hope everyone enjoyed the training session on today and that you have a great rest of your day. Thank you for joining.